Welcome back to The Explainer. Look, there's a ton of noise out there right now regarding the Ukraine-Russia conflict, right? So today, we're taking a step back. We are going to unpack a really deep structural analysis by political scientist Dr. Nicolai Petro to help us sort through the strategic forces actually at play here. Ultimately, we want to understand the mechanics of what's happening beneath the daily headlines.
Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for today. First, we'll hit the harsh mathematical realities of a war of attrition. Then we'll move into the tactical wildcard of drone warfare. From there, we're going to examine escalation and red lines, zoom out to the historical roots of the region's ideologies, and finally, wrap up by analyzing the massive geopolitical shifts happening globally right now.
All right, Section 1, the War of Attrition, where we look at actual battlefield realities and models.
You know, there is a really stark contrast between what we constantly hear and what the data might actually suggest. If we look at the dominant Western media narrative, the story is that Russia is on the brink of economic collapse, they're running completely out of military equipment, and relying heavily on forced conscription. But Dr. Petro's assessment presents a profoundly different picture. He notes that the Russian economy is actually growing despite Western sanctions. He also points out that Russia is largely maintaining a volunteer force, drawn by highly lucrative conditions, whereas Ukraine is the one deeply struggling with forced conscription. According to Petro's analysis, Russia currently holds what he calls an insurmountable material advantage, and he notes that Ukraine has been steadily losing ground since late 2023. Understanding this specific gap between popular perception and academic assessment is absolutely crucial for figuring out where this conflict is heading.
Because when you literally strip away the politics and just focus coldly on the math, actual forecasting models paint a very specific picture. Dr. Petro references quantitative models of attrition warfare, specifically from analysts like Peter Turchin and Warwick Powell. Based purely on logistics, production capability, and manpower resources, these models suggest a pretty grim trajectory for Ukraine. They point to an inevitable material advantage for Russia. In fact, these quantitative models forecast a potential military tipping point, essentially a collapse of Ukrainian frontline capacity, potentially by late summer or fall of this year. It's a sobering reminder that wars of attrition are ultimately decided by industrial output, not just morale.
Moving right along to Section 2, the drone warfare wildcard, looking at the totally uncharted territory of modern conflict.
Now this brings us to a super crucial concept. It's called strategic fog. We've all heard of the fog of war on the battlefield, right? But Dr. Petro, referencing political realist John Mearsheimer, points out a unique danger here. Strategic fog happens before or during early escalation. It occurs when political and military leaders make massive calculations based on entirely new technologies, like mass drone warfare, that simply have zero historical precedent. We just don't have established limits yet. We haven't had a Cuban Missile Crisis for drones to teach global powers where the actual final red lines are. For us watching from the outside, this perfectly explains why the timeline and the escalation patterns feel so totally unpredictable.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is that it all boils down to a terrifyingly simple question. How does a mass drone war actually end? And the truth? Nobody knows, because a mass drone war has never been fought to completion in human history. Military leaders and politicians are essentially flying blind right now. They don't know exactly how effective drones ultimately are against massive troop movements, or if they fundamentally alter how a major war is brought to a close.
That takes us to Section 3, escalation and red lines, and the severe dangers of testing deterrence.
So we have this highly tense dynamic, the paradox of deterrence. First, an opponent, like Russia in this case, establishes very clear boundaries and red lines. But here's the paradox Dr. Petro highlights. When you clearly draw a line, your deterrence is actually tested by your opponent pushing right up to that exact limit. And over time, if the opponent hasn't crossed the line, the fear of retaliation just sort of fades. Western nations and NATO have literally simulated strikes on Russian regions and provided intel for strikes deep into Russia. Because Russia has shown restraint so far, the fear of retaliation drops, which ironically increases the risk of an unintended, catastrophic breach of those original red lines. It's a very precarious situation.
All right, Section 4, the echoes of history. We're zooming out here to look at the ideological and World War II roots of the region.
Let's step back and look at the ideological history shaping this whole area. Dr. Petro highlights a concept called integral nationalism. To really understand it, let's compare it to other historical forces. Fascism historically relies on a single leader and party forging a national consensus. Nazism is similar, but has a specific, horrific, genetic, or racial component. Integral nationalism, however, which Petro identifies as a driving historical force for elements of the Ukrainian far right today, fosters a unified civic and military movement that demands a nation exclusively for its native people. So in this historical context, the goal was a Ukraine exclusively for Ukrainians.
So why does that specific older history matter to us right now? Well, President Zelensky recently honored a World War II figure named Andrei Melnik, actually stating Melnik had returned to the Ukraine of which he dreamed, but Melnik's history is incredibly complex. Back in 1939, he aligned his nationalist movement with European fascist movements. In 1941, he literally proposed a greater Ukraine to Adolf Hitler. Later, he pushed back against German policies and was ultimately arrested by the Germans in 1944 for secret contacts. Dr. Petro points out that while Melnik was undeniably a complex collaborator, his specific brand of integral nationalism serves as the model for the modern state being pushed by certain factions in Ukraine today.
Finally, Section 5, the geopolitical shift, focusing on the roles of global powers in managing this war.
Let's look at how these global powers are actually reacting to this attritional war today. Dr. Petro observes a pretty massive geopolitical shift. The United States is stepping back from its role as the primary co-belligerent. It's shifting that massive financial and military burden right over to the European Union. Meanwhile, the U.S. is attempting, albeit with reduced leverage, to pivot towards a role of mediation. This leaves the EU as the primary driver, still heavily committed to achieving a strategic battlefield victory over Russia.
And this brilliantly illustrates the dynamic with a pretty sobering metaphor from Dr. Petro. He says, the EU is in the position of being the manager of a boxing match, making money off of the fighter in the ring who is getting pummeled. It's a striking image. Petro suggests that the European Union is benefiting strategically from the conflict, testing its weapons, gauging Russia's resolve, without suffering the direct, devastating physical consequences that the fighter in the ring, Ukraine, is enduring every single day.
Building directly on that whole boxing manager idea, there are several vested interests that, according to Petro's analysis, actively discourage diplomacy. The EU gets to test its weapons in a live environment. Military industries are anticipating massive windfall profits from prolonged production. Even within Ukraine, Petro notes corruption scandals where elites secure resources and safe havens abroad. And perhaps most crucially of all, there is a total lack of immediate physical consequences for Western leaders. Their troops aren't dying on the ground, so the urgency for them to negotiate is drastically reduced.
Which brings us to a deeply provocative question that I want you to take away from this explainer. Is diplomacy even still possible given the massive gap between the desired geopolitical outcomes of the West and the harsh mathematical realities of attritional warfare on the ground? Dr. Petro's analysis suggests that until those two realities actually align, the conflict is just going to continue its current course. Thank you so much for joining me on this structured deep dive. If mapping out these concepts helped you grasp the strategic complexities at play here, keep seeking out the facts, keep studying the history, and I'll see you in the next explainer.